Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Shannon Jackson. I'm part of the executive committee of Berkeley Center for New Media. It's fabulous to welcome you here, co-sponsored with the Jacobs Institute, and really to welcome Danah Boyd. We're also want to acknowledge that we sit here on a lonely land, the unceded, violently secured territory of lonely land, and want to acknowledge that we're here at the invitation, if sometimes the violently secured invitation of the Ohlone people. And happy to welcome a speaker who brings together so many issues around old technologies, new technologies, and issues of equity. Danah Boyd was an alum of the Berkeley campus. It's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce her here. We just marked, and I'm sorry about my voice, it's not usually this gravelly. We just marked the 20th anniversary of the Berkeley Center for New Media with a very large celebration and symposium. With Danah here now, we have a chance to recall the early spirit and wide-ranging disciplinarity of BCNM's members and founders from 20 years ago, and to remember that graduate students like Danah were its early and most essential founders too. Indeed, it was almost 20 years ago-ish that I, a still relatively new professor at Berkeley and a mom of a toddler and a baby, tried out a new graduate course on ethnography and oral history in performance studies. Graduate students in performance studies signed up. They had to. It fulfilled a requirement. Other graduate students in humanities signed up too, and a graduate student from the School of Information signed up as well. She showed up at the seminar donning a furry cap with ear flaps and little laces stringing from the ears. She took off the cap to reveal multicolored dyed hair, opened a computer that seemed joined at her hip, festooned with multiple stickers. She introduced herself as Danah and told us about her interests in technology and teens. Danah Boyd quickly became the most reflective, one of the most reflective, most committed, most adventurous interview ethnographers in that crew. And all of us learned from her while she was learning from her interviewees. Her interview subjects were active agents, teens and preteens who talked to her about the sociality of social media, assuring her that freaked out adults should stop worrying because they had it all wrong. The research conducted then would become a breakout book that's still a must-read now. It's complicated. The social lives of network teens told us that no one had it all right. Boyd did not choose a side and still doesn't on the topic of digital bullying, but she did say that understanding its dynamics meant understanding young people better. Thinking about social and economic disparities, about growth patterns and pathways, about connecting, about belonging, about BFFing, about what it meant for all of us to consider in one of her best lines. Most teens aren't addicted to social media. If anything, they're addicted to each other. Danah's nuanced, contrarian, compassionate argument took hold, and she became a bestseller of a book that has been translated into 7 or more languages, earning her a spot at the World Economic Forum as a young global leader, a young innovator under 35 by Technology Review, and also earned her a moniker from the Financial Times as the High Priestess of Internet Friendship. Danah's influence only compounded over the last 15, 20-ish years with her co-founding of the Data and Society Research Institute, her status as a partner researcher for Microsoft, as a distinguished visiting professor at Georgetown. She has authored subsequently multiple groundbreaking articles on issues of media manipulation, privacy, tech policy, technological ethics, algorithmic accountability, and also co-authored 2 more books, on one titled Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, and another on that continued her work on teen youth culture, and another on participatory culture in a networked era. Danah Boyd is now incoming, maybe already in, not quite yet, professor of communication at Cornell University, and they are lucky to have her. We're lucky to have her here now. My toddler and my baby are now 20-ish years later in their 20s, and they still think I've got it all wrong, but I hope that they know I just want them to be all right. All right despite a world of climate disaster. All right despite humans who use human-made technology against other humans. All right because they and all of us and all of you have to know that the world is not given to us, but something we make, something we tend, something we remake, something that cares for us as long as we care for it. Throughout her entire career, Danah never lets us vilify technology as an enemy encroaching on vulnerable humans, always reminding us that technology is human-made, and therefore a reflection of, sometimes an exacerbation of, vulnerabilities that are inside of us all, inside of ourselves. She will surely bring that perspective and many more to the lecture she offers us today. Data are made, not found. Please give it up for the one and only Danah Boyd.
It is amazing to be back here. I actually was among the earliest class of BCNM, and I was drilling people earlier of like what all has happened here over the last 20 years, because 20 years ago, I remember it being such a sparkle in my advisor's eye without any clue of where it would become. So it's so great to see so many people so deeply engaged and out here to join me today. As Shannon mentioned, I've gone through a lot of different research projects in my career, and so I'm going to offer one that I've been sort of living with and thinking about in recent days that I feel like gets at some of the big battles that we're having around data politics. But there's Q&A, so feel free to prepare questions in all sorts of different directions. So what I've been fascinated by in this conversation of computing is the importance of responsible AI. Because what the heck does that mean? What does it mean to design, to develop, to deploy, to use AI responsibly? Who defines what that responsibility looks like? How do we actually grapple with that? And it's one of those things that I've noticed is a topic where people have this normative assumption of how to get there. And so 5 years ago, I sat down with a group of colleagues and tried to disentangle some of this. At the time, we were really interested in another set of normative claims, that we should just make technology more fair, equally questioning what happens there. And so then we were sort of playing with this. We wrote a paper, which I'll come back to. And then 2 years ago, I've been returning to some of my work that Shannon mentioned about young people, in part because I really want to strangle some policymakers who have been engaging in a concept that I and Maria Angel have been talking as techno-legal solutionism, another concept we'll get to. And so this is this moment where I started bringing these things together, and this talk is an attempt to bring these things together. Big old asterisks, for anybody who's ever written a book, there's a moment where you hate the book you're writing, and so you want to talk about anything other than the book. I want to acknowledge that I have submitted for review a book about the US Census Bureau. We can talk about the Census Bureau. This is not the Census Bureau talk, although ironically this is probably going to be the Census book title. So work with me there. So one of the things that I've been thinking about as we get to this question of responsibility is something that I want you to hold on to as we start to weave through other topics today. I want to point out that responsible AI is not a state of being. Like democracy or like security, the idea of being responsible is not something to be achieved, but a commitment that we need to make and to constantly work towards. And when we recognize that not as something that will ever be achieved, we start to realize the ways in which ethics is co-constructed and engaged across all of us. All right, I want you to hold that because we're now going to dive into some of those abstraction traps that start with fairness before we go through things. So this project, I should note, began as a complete and utter joke. So what happens when two computer scientists, two sociologists, and a lawyer walk into a room? Clearly the answer is they write a paper. And at the time, the five of us were trying to make sense of this conversation around fairness and machine learning. And we were fascinated by how these nascent conversations in a field that's now known as fact would get stuck on certain registers. And we were sort of intrigued by the stuckness. What would get people so caught up in a particular frame? As we kept coming back to the notion of traps. And we also kept coming back to this in the layers of thinking about abstraction. So for anybody with a computer science background, you know that day one of a computer science class is all about abstraction and layers of abstraction. So what were the layers of abstraction and the traps that we got caught into, and how do we start to disentangle those? And so when we started doing this, we started realizing that we not only could see some of the problems that were really commonplace, but they applied to many other areas. So I want to take, this is the paper that this sort of riffs off of, but I'm going to take the traps that we articulated then, talking about fairness, and think about what that means more broadly in computing and AI generally right now. So the first one we sort of flagged was the framing trap, right? Which is the failure to model the entire system over which a social criterion, such as fairness, will be enforced. And so what that means, more practically, is that you end up becoming so obsessed on the one thing that if you just fix the one thing, that will be, you'll fix the whole big puzzle. And we were really frustrated by how common this was. People had technical systems that they were going to solve inequities in distribution of resources, but they were so focused here that they missed the bigger picture. And we started seeing how these kinds of narrow approaches to trying to understand things based on what could be computationally defined became a constant trap. And so this is an example of something that we then turned around and used our STS thinking to sort of flip on its side and be like, how do you actually combat this trap? Because this trap is something we're seeing in many different areas, such as AI, right? Which is that, like, I will solve XYZ problem, say climate change, mentioned earlier, by just fixing it with AI on the one thing that I can optimize without even accounting for the climate disaster that is AI itself. Right? And so these moments of being able to trap. So we got obsessed with this notion of heterogeneous engineering. So for those who are not familiar with this STS concept, it's sort of a beautiful way that goes beyond what we normally talk about in more general concepts as stakeholder engagement. So participatory engagement, stakeholder engagement is the idea of bringing people to the table so that their voices can be participating in something. But there's a longer history in engineering to think about heterogeneous engineering, which is how do you have different people constructing and engineering a system where they actually have the contestation that they're involved in as part of the process. And this is really important because when you think about a lot of engineering systems, you have to think about how they're tightly coupled and they're complex in their structures. So you could build, say, an iPhone, but if you don't have cellular technology, that is ludicrous, right? Your iPhone, as you imagine it, requires all of this infrastructure. And so the part in the practice of doing heterogeneous engineering is to understand how the development of a system needs to be entangled with all of these other systems, and how do you bring those entanglements to the table. So you're not just thinking about the people that are interested in the design, the particular design of, say, the iPhone, but you're actually thinking about all of the entanglements at social, political, and technical levels. And so I say this because one of the things that I've noticed in the conversations of responsible AI is how many companies in this area have been obsessed with creating a checklist, right? That they're going to solve responsible AI by the following list of things that are going to be done after the system is built. And then they can check it off like a safety checklist and they're done. That is not heterogeneous engineering. That is legal liability, right? And so thinking about how you actually embed it through these systems. And this is also where I think it's really important to take another critical part about thinking about those complex systems. When you have a complex system, the process of trying to map and model and doing heterogeneous engineering runs in the face of efficiency. When you have an efficient system, you cut out all of this stuff. You narrow the problem, you focus in on this problem, and you hope the other things will get worked out in the end. And so this is one of the challenges I've seen in a lot of modern AI development, which is that we've become so obsessed with efficiency, and we'll get into speed, that we've lost track of building robust systems. And the whole point of heterogeneous engineering as a frame is to think about robustness. All right, a second trap that we became obsessed with is a portability trap. What happens, I guess the definition is failure to understand how repurposing algorithmic solutions designed for one social context may be misleading, inaccurate, or otherwise do harm when applied to a different context. And so we see this over and over again. You have an amazing system that's been designed to do weather modeling, and you think that that is going to help you understand criminal justice, right? That is a portability trap. That is what happens when we don't understand all of the social and cultural context below that. And I'm fascinated by how this has become part and parcel with a lot of AI obsessions of like, well, I will just gobble up all of the data, and then we can model on the data that we can find, and that model will work for everything else. That's a really great thing until you start to think about what data these systems are actually built on. And one of the things that you'll see with a lot of the training set is it involves the open internet. And the open internet, complete with Reddit, ends up with a really interesting dynamic of, let's just say, the meme underworld. And it turns out that when you start making a bunch of visual images related to the meme underworld, you're building on training of the meme underworld, all of a sudden you get frogs. And I'll let you guys do your own research to figure that one out. You also get a lot of people with their arms at 45-degree angles. And so you'd be amazed at how much energy is put into the trying to calming down of visual AI imagery to resist certain symbolisms that are very commonplace on the internet. This is because a portability structure that is based on thinking that the online meme space is portable to everyday environments is deeply flawed. And the other place where this comes up, of course, is large language models. And I'm fascinated by the sort of things that happen in LLMs when they go terribly awry, which I've had the privilege of getting to work with. Because one of the things that is often missed, especially by people whose only language is English, is that they miss that language is very much the manifestation of cultural norms and logics. There is no such thing as a general purpose language. That is why translation is hard. Translation is not simply the act of moving a noun from one language to another. And we miss a lot of this as we start to see these things get built into LLMs. And so for those who might be fluent in, say, Arabic or Japanese, these are languages for which it is so critical to think about the artistry of the construction of language. And it's truly mind-boggling to an English speaker who is so pragmatic in their language structure. But even more are sort of seeing where natural language processing systems completely break. And I'm particularly fascinated by polysynthetic languages, such as Inuit or Yupik in this land, because the very idea of a stable noun is nonsensical in these languages. These languages are fundamentally relational at their very essence. There's no such thing as a word or a noun that can be stabilized in this fashion. And so when you actually have LLMs trained on English, they lose all of these relational structures that are so embedded in it. It's one of the reasons you talk to the indigenous and AI people. They do not know how to do AI NLP structures on certain languages because the very foundations and fabrics of those languages are different. And so it's not just that we lose in translation a lot of different cultural pieces, but we also start to flatten the beauty of what is language. And we take it back to this deeply pragmatic piece where it's just about, some form of very surface level communication. And so when we keep talking about LLMs are going to be able to communicate everything, it's like, no, we're going to see the loss of a lot of different things. And so if you want to see this also has been playing out in other places long before LLMs. And so some of the places I've been intrigued by have to do with where we end up in collisions, places where language collides in ways that strike us in different ways. So consider something like what Francesca Tripodi found. She found that search engines, which of course are baked on the idea of understanding the entire network structure of links, but also of language, what happens when you search for certain terms? When do they collide and when do they not? So something like searching for coronavirus, you're also going to get results for COVID-19. We generally think of this as a good thing, right? Where we see language that is used, that is very specific to different kinds of communities, we can bring them together, we can see those connections. But that doesn't always go over well. What happens when somebody searches for illegals? Should they also get information related to undocumented peoples? Should people who are searching for undocumented peoples also get things related to illegals? Those terms are not synonyms culturally, even if we recognize that they have a relationship to them. And so what happens when we start to see LLMs start to produce content? And we're already seeing this. This is the fight over whether LLMs are woke or not, right? Which is when you ask for things about immigration and culture, and you get back things that say illegals, that is deeply offensive to many people, right? And so how do you grapple with this? And this is something that the technical systems are missing all of the cultural moments. And one of the reasons why we're seeing culture wars play out across how these LLMs are working. All right, a third trap that we grapple with is the formalism trap. And this is the failure to account for the full meaning of social concepts such as fairness, which can be procedural, contextual, contestable, and cannot be resolved through mathematical formalisms, right? And so this is where we started with, of course, the notion of fairness. How do you mathematically define fairness? And I will tell you, if you aren't involved in the fact community, there are literally hundreds of papers debating on how to do this, and none of them agree, and they're all fighting with one another about the perfect math. And I have to say, this makes me crack up. And in part, it makes me crack up because we've seen this story before, over and over and over again. And my favorite of it from my own work has to do with privacy. Because it turns out social concepts are messy, they're context specific, and they're nuanced. So how do we define privacy? Many people will go back to the sort of classic Warren Brandeis definition of the right to be let alone. And I want to be clear, it's let alone, not left alone, and those things actually mean different things. And so people spent years trying to mathematically and legally define privacy under these terms. They have made a mess out of it. You talk about literature that has hundreds of different definitions. And part of why I got involved in this is I was doing the work on young people, and I realized that they had something really important to say about the right to be let alone, because actually what they were really attending to was their ability to control a social situation. So that notion of privacy was not something that was intrinsic to an object or intrinsic to a piece of a document. It was instead something that was always structured and relational. Right? So they would get offended when Facebook would suddenly pop up something from a year ago, because even though it was public, it was out of context. It was out of the social situation. They didn't have control of it, and they would talk about it as a privacy issue. And so this is always important to me, because when we start to look at things as socially constructed in this way, we realize we can't stabilize that in a mathematical definition of an object, right? That doesn't sit within the object, that sits within the relationships. And so Alice Marwick and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how people would sort of navigate these different pieces, how they navigated these privacy issues as these forms of entanglement. And what we are finding is that the same struggles, by the way, lawyers and computer scientists are still obsessed that they can find the perfect definition of privacy. All these decades on, they still have failed at this around the world because they're missing sort of this way in which it's socially negotiated. So one of the things that this comes up and reminds me of is what's going on right now with the training issue of AI. And so we end up, again, back to a computer science versus legalese battle around training data. Is this intellectual property? Who owns it, has the right to it, but it's publicly accessible so we can get it? And you're like, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And what's missing in this is the social dynamics at play here. And the social dynamics are being flattened in order to get this. This is the challenge with the formalism problem. And so in particular, I'm sort of interested in what's going on with Stack Overflow. And for those who aren't familiar with Stack Overflow, it's been a space for quite some time now, where people will ask technical questions and get technical feedback and leave these documents in gory details with shared code that will allow people to make sense of a programming language. It's beautiful. But what makes it so beautiful is the fact that it's a community, it's relational, it's the very act of asking for information that matters. It is not actually about the content itself. And yet what has happened is that almost all of the AI training models have said, oh, this is free and open web, so like all game on, we're going to take all of this content and train on it. And it didn't just make for reasonable AI in its first pass of being able to answer computing questions. It destroyed the Stack Overflow community. And the Stack Overflow community is still struggling, trying to figure out what it means because they upended the social rules. And one of the ways that I like to think of this, I often, Marianne's here, and she and I have had great conversations over the years around gifting. Because I think that there's something really important about how Stack Overflow has operated as a gifting economy. People share information, they gift the answer to people's questions in a way that builds a form of social debt. We will go more so mouse for those who are in that literature. And it's a way of building a form of social debt and being recognized in the process. It built a social fabric through the gifting dynamic. AIs are not gifting in this dynamic. They are absolutely just extracting. And they are extracting in a way that severs the social ties of those who had indebted relations with one another. And so this is one of the ways in which we see this when we start to think of it as legal or we start to think of it as technical. We miss all of the social entanglements, and that's what the formalism piece gets us in different ways. And I think it's one of the ways to understand ethics. Ethics is not a stable thing where you've gotten to a checkbox. Ethics has to be relational at every turn. And the moment that you are able to formalize a definition of ethics, the moment you're able to formalize a definition of property, the moment you lose all the social fabric that actually makes a lot of those things work. All right, next trap is the ripple effect trap, and that's the failure to understand how the insertion of a technology into an existing social system changes the behaviors and embedded values of that pre-existing system. And so this has been a fascinating thing watching the industry as it sort of jumps on things and it thinks that it can solve everything with AI. And there's something amazingly arrogant about doing what I think of as a technical mic drop and expecting everybody to just cope with the ripple effects, right? And that is where we've gotten to with a lot of this AI rhetoric. And we'll get back to some of how that becomes so extreme. But this failure to recognize that they're part of a social system, an economic, a political, social system, and not acknowledging the different kinds of harm that's at play. And so I really want us to attend to the ripple effects. And it's one of the things as scholars that I think we can do a lot of work on is acknowledging and building in visibility of the broader social system at play. And that's also important because, again, I'll pull back to a sociological notion because one of my favorite set of literatures in sociology comes from this notion called normal accidents theory. And this was constructed by Charles Perrault after he was trying to understand what happened in 3 Mile Island. And I don't know if there are other Pennsylvania people, but I grew up in the shadow of 3 Mile Island, which ended in near catastrophe, an environmental disaster. And he went in to understand what broke, right? What failed in the system that nearly led to a nuclear meltdown. And what he found was that every one of those actors was doing the best that they could with the information they had. They were definitely having user interface issues with the information they were encountering. The actions they were taking were creating ripple effects in all sorts of other ways, and they were trying to respond to it and they didn't know. And what he argued beautifully was that when you have very complex systems, especially ones that are tightly coupled, where one thing depends on another in really notable ways, that all it takes is one problem in one piece, and it will ripple effect across the system and bring the system down. And he's pointing this out to say that, of course, the nice thing to do is reduce the complexity of our system to prevent all of these kinds of entanglements in particular ways. But certain technologies, and he's first to point out, certain technologies will always be complex and tightly coupled. And we keep inventing more of those kinds of systems. And so Perrault ends up offering a different frame for getting past this. He argues that instead of always trying to decomplexify, because at the end of the day, see aviation, you're gonna fly a tin can into the sky, right? That is a complex, tightly coupled system. That the way to manage that is to really think about how to build resilience. And this involves redundancy, this involves backstops, this involves buffer, temporal buffer, financial buffer, structural buffer. In many ways, and again, we're going to keep coming back to this, everything that is the opposite of efficiency. Okay? Efficiency, disruption, these are in opposition to the forms of resilience that are necessary to prevent ripple effects. And so when we actually introduce large technical systems into an already complex society, if we want to make certain that they are well absorbed, you actually have to do a lot of social, political, technical work to make certain that that can play out. We are not doing that with AI. And what does it mean then that we're dropping different technologies into already existing fragile systems? You know, like American society. Small problems. And how do we grapple with those ripple effects? So our final of the original frames was to think about solutionism and the solutionism trap, right? And this is the failure to recognize the possibility that the best solution to a problem may not involve technology, right? I got into trouble. We wrote this paper, by the way, in, I think we wrote it in 2016, 2017, and I tried to call it the Elon Musk trap, and I was not allowed to. My colleagues were like, no, because he was at the time mouthing off that you could fix all problems with his submarine. And I think we're now living with a different version of this, but it's the same. So I want to point this out because AI is not there to fix everything in the kitchen sink. I actually love AI, and this talk might give you the sense that I am not appreciative of it. But the kinds of work that are happening in medicine, the kinds of work that are happening in science are unbelievably inspiring. But that does not mean that just because we have this technology that we can fix those problems. It doesn't mean we solve those problems. And in fact, one of the problems we have with these AI technologies is that the justification comes by saying this will solve X, Y, Z. And I want us to actually avoid the word solutions because of this. In fact, I would argue that the problem with our obsession with solutionism means that we don't look to problems that do not involve technology. And so one of the things that I've been asking of computer scientists and policymakers writ large is to eradicate the word solution from your vocabulary entirely. And what that means is that I want you to say a different word instead. I want you to step back and say the word intervention. Now think about it. If I've got a solution to something, I have made a set of commitments where I believe that if I put that thing into place, it will have this amazingly awesome, desirable outcome, even though we know that often is not the case. But when we use the word intervention, we shift our entire frame of reference. We are going to change the conditions of an environment by intervening in that environment with something that we hope will have this amazing outcome. But when we intervene, we then follow up with a question. Was it effective? Did it do what we wanted to do? How do we respond to the system at play? And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking, because when you solve something, you don't have to think about the aftermath of it. You don't look at the other side. But when you intervene, you do. And I'll point this out because we're going to come back to this in different ways. And the first place we're going to get to this is my deep frustration with policymakers these days. So when we originally talked about these traps, we saw them as technical traps, but that were happening within the computing practice. But what we increasingly saw is that policymakers have been adopting solutionistic language into their own approach. And arguably, they've been doing this for a very long time in different ways, but they've now gone one step further. They keep arguing that because technologies cause the problem, that they can solve the problem if they just did it differently. And the place where you get a bee in my bonnet on this has to do with a bunch of provisions called duty of care provisions in the Kids Online Safety Acts. And the duty of care provisions suggest that if Facebook only wanted to, it could solve large complex problems like bullying. This drives me bonkers. And so Maria and Angela and I went deep into this, and we started to realize that we have gotten to a point where solutionistic thinking is so deeply entangled, not just with tech culture, but with those who absorb and think tech is part of the future in a really good way. And so we get to this point where we now have policymakers demanding companies to be solutionistic, okay? And that is a really notable shift, because when you demand a company to be solutionistic, you give them power and authority in a way that is really questionable. And so I'll go back to the bullying issue since Shannon brought it up, which is that bullying has been a problem long before we had technology, right? And one of the most fascinating and weirdest thing about bullying data is that it actually did not increase with the rise of the internet. Nobody seems to believe this, but it's a fascinating piece of the data. And when now it became more visible, we can talk about bullying until the cows come in, but the most interesting is we had a natural experiment. What happened during COVID when kids were maximally online and unable to see each other in person because schools were all virtual? Bullying disappeared. It was shocking, right? And it was a good reminder of the entanglement that bullying has between the online and the offline space. So instead, we now have lawmakers who are upset that there is bullying. So now they're going to sit there and they're going to say, dear tech companies, you will solve bullying. They are in no position to solve bullying. They can't do it, even if they wanted to. And half the time when they design things that they think are helpful, it backfires in all sorts of different ways. So what does it actually mean to hold them accountable for this? And that has its own other politics we can go into. Now I want to be clear for those who are sort of designers in the room, this does not mean that there can't be good things put into place in terms of interventions. And seatbelts are the canonical one, right? Now the thing about the history of seatbelts is that it was not the same as telling car companies, thou shalt stop all car accidents, right? Turns out that does not work very well. Instead, tons of research went into showing the efficacy of seatbelts and how seatbelts were the right intervention. Did they prevent all accidents? Did they prevent all deaths in accidents? Absolutely not. But they made enough of a nudge that what ended up happening is you have policymakers saying that all cars must be manufactured with seatbelts available. That was step one. And people are required by law to actually wear them. Does that mean people always wear them? No, right? And the question is, how far do you go? Do you get to the point where the car won't start because the seatbelt doesn't go on? I don't know how many of you have dealt with this. We have a package on the other seat, and you're like, would you please acknowledge that's a package that does not need a seatbelt? Right, so we've gotten to a point where we ripple through this. These are interventions once we know that the intervention is effective. The challenge in most of the current approaches, and we're not looking at interventions, we're saying you will solve things. And that's where it flips out in different ways. All right. Those were the concepts of the past, and so I want to give you a few that I've been thinking about more generally. And Jennifer Teshi and I are 2 weeks away from trying to write this into a proper paper, so hopefully you will see it in a proper paper soon. But we were thinking about how, now that we have both company-related logics and we have policy-making logics, where else are we technology-related logics and policy-making logics, how are we going further with AI to seeing broader business and societal level issues? Because one of the things that we have been totally struck by is how that from the moment that the tech industry told you that we've solved all communication problems and have changed all jobs through AI, every journalist and university has gotten on this with like, yeah, we're going to invest all our money in AI. And we're all like, what? And there's a whole set of other traps that have come with this. So I want to give you 3 of them that I think are really notable for the kinds of cultural work that they do because they are propagated not just by technologists and not just by policymakers, but by journalists and academics and a variety of other actors at play. The first one is the inevitability trap. And this is the failure to recognize that the future is not preordained. For anybody in an STS bet, you're gonna be like, duh. But this is one of the things that's been driving me bonkers dealing with these broader conversations. Because, again, if you think deterministically, if X, then Y, right, which is a very deterministic statement. Determinism is the foundation of solutionism, because therefore, if I have Y, I can solve X, right? Like that's how that logic goes. And what you get is, of course, if I build it, the problem will be solved. The deterministic structure fails to recognize that that process does not go inevitably, right? And this, by the way, for the philosophers in the room, this is long-standing fights, and we can discuss the history of this in philosophy because it's a really intriguing one of whether or not the future is preordained in particular ways. But the way that inevitability plays out within society is that it's the collective development and collective commitment to a deterministic frame where we make the deterministic frame into being. And that's what we have been collectively doing with AI. We've collectively been drumbeating it to its very existence, the idea that it will be there in particular ways. And so not only at this point is the tech industry propagating a radical reworking of labor and society through its inevitability rhetoric, but so many people have adopted it and absorbed it and taken it on beyond that. And so we're now at a point where we are seeing such strong inevitability frames about so many things. It will inevitably destroy democracy, or it inevitably will save democracy. I love the contradictions there. It will inevitably result in significant underemployment. But the thing is AI will not inevitably do anything. That is up to us. The thing is, it will be used over and over again as a justification for so many things. So if you want to watch what's happening in the tech industry or what's happening in government right now, because government is learning to be efficient for the first time ever, these two things are being narrated as, well, we've got technology, we don't need these workers. Well, the reality is actually that's just cover for a lot of different kinds of power and politics and capitalist agendas. And so what happens when we, again, as researchers, as scholars, when you hear inevitability, you should go ding, 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 and be like, who is getting what from this frame? It's not just follow the money, it's follow the inevitability frame. And so this is where I think it's important to see, again, back to the bigger picture of what is the broader socio-technical arrangement? Who is creating different conditions to enable certain kind of futures? Right? Again, I'll use a very simple sort of STS orientation, which is the idea that the future, again, is not preordained, but the actions we take in the present create different probabilistic outcomes of what will happen in the future. That is why we have agency, right? How we make changes into systems, we make certain futures more or less likely. That is why we build policy. That is why we take action over and over again. And those actions are really important. But if we let the future be predefined, what we do is we collectively get on board to narrow the different possible futures into the one that becomes inevitable. And I want to push back against that and say, no, we can have many different futures. And I'll think about somebody like Ruha Benjamin, whose work on imagination is just brilliant, because it's about what are the different imaginations that we work to, so that we can keep opening up the flexibility. The other thing that, of course, comes as a trap with this has to do with the disruption trap, right, which is the failure to account for and address the true cost of valorizing disruption. This is, again, connected to that ripple effect trap, but with an important tweak. Ripple effects come from not seeing how everything is connected. The disruption trap is rooted in a commitment that disruption and creating ripple effects is inherently good. And I have to admit that whenever I hear about like how generative AI is going to disrupt every business, industry, and job, I immediately start to think about who is benefiting from creating the conditions for disruption. And one of the things that I sort of keep coming back to is Manuel Castells. And I don't know if you are familiar with this sociologist, but he is really interested in how power is structured and arranged. He's, by the way, for those who don't like reading high theory, it's very annoying because he has a whole theory of network power that he calls network power and network power and networking power and network making power, and I'm really sorry for that. But the basic tenet that he is pointing out, which I think is important, power sits within how networks of people and practices are arranged, right? And the structuring and structure of those networks matters for shaping what power is possible. That as individual actors, we have agency to help build and network, and that the most central forms of power are those who know how to create the entire network themselves. Okay? What the disruption story is about purposefully cleaving existing networks to knowingly restructure the networks as a power play. Now, we can think about this in sort of like contemporary environments, right? Like, what happens if you know that the tariffs are coming and you can completely arrange your economic conditions to respond to it? Funny that. What does it also mean politically to sit there as a venture capitalist and be like, okay, we're going to massively disrupt all of these things so that we can hedge it, right? So that we can purposefully decide how to rearrange the networks. And that's a lot of what's going on in different conversations around AI. And this doesn't mean that there won't be disruptions in the future. Of course there are going to be disruptions. We are going to keep seeing disruptions. But how those disruptions play out depends on more than just the technology. It depends on all of our participation in creating the conditions that respond and build resilience to that disruption. It means being able to see how those structures are vulnerable to disruption and who will benefit from effectively rearranging those in a way that makes sense for them. And I point this out because I always love coming back to the old history of the Luddites. For those who aren't familiar with the Luddites, they get a bad rap because it turns out that the Luddites were not actually angry at technology. They liked technology perfectly fine. They were angry at capitalists and politicians, including the really, really crazy one that was the king. They were very angry at the conditions that were being set up and that the technology was being used to actually solidify certain arrangements of political economic power, which is why they challenged it. But the very act of challenging the political arrangements, the economic arrangements, meant that they were all hung. They were killed for trying to challenge it. And from henceforth, they were then demonized as being anti-technology, so it was a warning sign to people who challenged and critiqued technology. I think it's a good reminder at this moment, because what it means to critique AI isn't necessarily about critiquing the technology, but critiquing the political and powerful arrangements. All right. One final trap here is the speed trap, which is the failure to acknowledge and protect society from the unintended consequences of moving too fast. As we know, faster, faster, faster is really a mantra of a lot of tech industry logic right now. And that mantra, that speed trap, is intentional because it means that it's trying to move through and resist the creation of alternate resilient networks. The faster you can move, and you can do things that are malevolent in different ways, the faster it's hard to catch up. So you can't really necessarily call a company out on its really monopolistic practices when you wait 8 years to bring them to the FTC. So it's because by then everything has become stabilized in particular ways. So speed is to an advantage if you're aiming to rearrange those networks. And so you should be looking to resist speed. Resisting speed is a political action. It is the ability to say, I'm not letting you move that fast. If you are not able to move that fast, there's abilities to actually create things around this. And again, this is where I love the social construction of technology literature. So those who don't know Scott, social construction of technology, the idea is that technologies are co-constructed through many different ways. For those who have ever watched The Social Network, when Tristan Harris tells you there was only one way to design a bicycle, you must laugh at this, because literally the canonical discussion in Scott is the history of bicycle. There were many, many, many ways to design a bicycle. They had multiple wheels. You sat sideways on them. They had big wheels. They had different sized wheels. There were all sorts of discussions. So what did it take to get to the canonical bicycle that we are familiar with? That two-wheeled bicycle was a process of what is considered closure, right? Getting us to something that would allow us to standardize something. The process before it is known as interpretive flexibility. Again, we have different futures that might be possible or not. And so what happens is that the faster you can move to closure, certain people win. So when you watch tech execs walk into to Washington, D.C. and demand regulation, what they're trying to do is create closure on their definition of the technology so that they close off on the other possible interpretations of that technology. And the thing, again, as a political act, is you resist closure through interpretive flexibility, through maintaining the different possible futures, the different possible outcomes. That is the political move. Of course, it's a really interesting and challenging political move when every news organization wants to tell you that the future is inevitable, right? And that's one of the reasons why that resistance is to resist rhetorical closure, because rhetorical closure almost always precedes technical closure, right? And so you need to resist that rhetorical closure as a way of reclaiming the interpretive flexibility of a particular technology. This is a way of sort of looking back at those technologies. Of course, but the industry speed is going for closure. It's trying to tell you that, like, we are the good guys. We will make sure the regulations work really well for us. We won't deal with the other ramifications of it. We will disrupt the entire global economy at record speed, because the only then possible future are the technologies we've designed to solve it. Right? That is a setup. That is a setup that is a political setup as much as it is a technology setup. And we are in the middle of a massive land grab on not just this technology, but the political futures, not just of this country, but of many different environments that are entirely entangled with the systems. All right, In the paper, we went through a ton of different kinds of things. I mentioned heterogeneous engineering. There's a lot more to it. I'm going to let you research those if you want. But I want to give you a couple of other ways of seeing sort of where to resist some of the common fixes to these frames. My favorite is humans in the loop, because everybody means so well when they want to just put humans in the middle of things, because that'll work out well, right? We actually have a nice history here. We have the history of aviation. Turns out the Federal Aviation Administration in the 1970s debated whether or not autopilot should exist. They decided to kick out the navigator, unnecessary, decided to keep the pilot and co-pilot in the loop in case the machine went badly. Okay, what does that mean? That has meant for the last 50 years, we have de-skilled, actively de-skilled pilots on the job so that they could babysit machines, and then they are expected to step in when the worst possible things go wrong, and assumes that that handoff goes well. Yeah. My favorite example of this is Captain Sully. He is a fascinating character in showing us why this is a ridiculous setup. Captain Sully is best known for the landing on the Hudson. Some of you might be familiar. And when he landed that plane on the Hudson, he did something really interesting. The entire time, air traffic control was telling him to go to Teterboro. This was plane, I don't know if you guys have seen the Tom Hanks movie, but basically plane, birds in engines gone, now what to do? FAA is telling him, go to Teterboro. He's like, I can't make it to Teterboro. They're like, absolutely you can. All the technical models say that you can. Ding, 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 warning. And he's like, I can't. I know from experience I can't make it to Teterboro. And they're like, yes, you can. You cannot land on the Hudson. And he's like, I absolutely can land on the Hudson. I'm going to land on the Hudson. Of course, he does land on the Hudson. He saves everybody. Whee, miracle story. Here's the thing. He wouldn't have been able to make it to Teterboro. His experience was right. He'd seen new construction on the Hudson in New Jersey. He would have crashed into it. 2, he had been de-skilled on the job, dissatisfied throughout his entire career, so he had a weekend job. Every weekend, he retrained pilots how to fly planes after years of them not actually being able to do anything other than babysit machines. You are talking about the best skilled person to possibly land a plane on the Hudson. In the FAA decisions, he sits there and says, by the way, the Airbus didn't let me override key things. If I could have overridden those technical things, I would have had 5 more minutes before it sank, and it could have been a huge difference in my success. And so this is a really interesting thing then when we get to the MAX 8 and 9, right? Because pilots are not able to override. So what ends up happening in humans in the loop scenario, we put the humans in the loop, we de-skill them, we make them so that they are powerless except to receive the moral impact of what's going on. And then we say that because the humans are incompetent, we need to give more power to the technical machines. Madeline Ellis does a great job. She calls this the moral crumple zone, which is the sort of intervention of what happens to humans in the loop. Because for humans in the loop to be effective, the entire structural system needs to be arranged to continuously allow that human to have power. And more often than not, that's not how it plays out. Another concept to sort of think about as an intervention has to do with socio-technical security. For anybody who's ever practiced in fields of security, whether we're talking cybersecurity, physical security, or international security, one of the most interesting things about security is that any practitioner of security knows you will never be able to secure a system. It's not possible. You constantly do work to make it more secure, not secure. And inevitably, you're going to get blamed when something goes wrong because inevitably you're going to be de-resourced into that point. And I point this out because we're talking so obsessively about red teaming in AI without actually acknowledging the security elements of it. Red teaming does not fix a system. It is an ongoing process to constantly try to find the vulnerabilities, to keep the vulnerabilities going. And so if you want to think about security, we want to think about those places where we don't just focus on making the system secure, but build the processes to constantly make it more secure at any given point. Let's see here. Now, this also is important because, again, I'm on a way aviation kick, I warn you, and this John Downer book is just beautiful. Because what he does is points out that systems are also made more secure, made more stable through testing. But testing does not come out of thin air. And so he has this whole book going into way too many details on what it takes to actually make a plane safe. And if you want to sort of feel the visceralness of this, if we allowed the planes to crash today at the same rate they did during the first decade of aviation, we'd have 40,000 planes down a year. That has been the improvement in safety. It is phenomenal. And we'll put another asterisk until private equity took over Boeing. And so I think I want to warn people because this is a process. And by the way, also this book goes into details about throwing chickens into engines. Fascinatingly weird. Turns out that's how planes were made more secure. But I say this because this process, and what is so notable about this process, is that you build on each other. It's a systems process. It's an entire industry process. Security and safety do not happen with individual actors. They happen because the entire ecosystem comes together. Finally, I'll point out great work by Lee Vinsel and Andy Russell on their innovation delusion work, where they point out and give a total love letter to the importance of maintenance and repair. Our technical systems can be beautiful when they're launched, and they will degrade over time, which anybody who's experienced a search engine lately probably knows, right? You need to maintain it. But we also need to maintain different levels of the infrastructure. We are already witnessing losses of huge amounts of key infrastructure in ways we don't recognize. And one of those has to do with our data infrastructure. And I want to give massive love to the Internet Archive sort of here in town because of the importance of trying to maintain those data infrastructures. What does it mean to see, learn to see the invisible infrastructures and learn to maintain and repair them? That's going to be crucial to any AI functioning because like I mentioned with Stack Overflow, once it's gone, it's gone. And that's actually what we're doing with a lot of other systems. Which I will happily tell you stories about Doge if anybody wants to go there. So I want to put this out because AI is so shiny and pretty, but we don't realize that you actually have to build maintenance and repair structures from the get-go. They get built into systems. They cannot be added later on top. And we are at a moment where everybody thinks that this is such a land grab and speed, speed, speed is everything, that they're not building those infrastructures. That goes back to our bigger concept of resilience. Everything needs to be about thinking in terms of resilience. To get to resilience, you resist efficiency. To get to resilience, you resist closure. To get to resilience, you resist speed, right? Everything is in opposition to things like blitzscaling. And that means that you're resisting a dominant set of rhetoric that is rhetoric not just necessary for the design or development of a system, but rhetoric right now that is a political act. A political act of trying to reconfigure the networks of our society by pushing us in a place that will not allow us to imagine alternate futures. And the beauty of being on a campus, the beauty of being in this kind of environment is that you can imagine alternate futures. You can see alternate conditions, and that's absolutely critical. And we're back to the final point, which is responsible AI is not an end state. There is no such thing. It is a mindset. It is a mindset of being able to think about how you build societal level resilience, how you resist these tools being used to absolutely push forward different structures of inequity, to push forward different kinds of value systems that are fundamentally harmful. And how do we do that? That becomes a political act in its own right. Thank you very much. Do we need mics? Mics behind you.
In the beginning, like you mentioned how the Inuit language doesn't have the.
Sorry, louder.
Like Inuit language only has every noun only or things only have a meaning.
It's relational.
Relational. Like what's an example of that?
So you will usually hear this in a deeply stereotyped, horrible way of like, the Inuit people have a bazillion words for snow. And you're like, oh my gosh, that is not actually what's going on in the language. Snow, conceptually, is actually relational to time, space, to weather, etc. It's not an object we talk about. And so the reason why it has a million words for snow is because it's all relational. It's also true that in most, you can pick in a lot of the other languages, even the very act of saying hello to you, I will say hello to you, I will acknowledge the time of day, I will acknowledge the location, I will acknowledge our relationship, I will acknowledge the setting, etc. So the word hello is not a stable thing. It's situated relationally in how we talk. And that's one of the reasons why the very act of trying to pull language down to these discrete roots like a noun don't work. So that's the concept of polysynthetic languages, which is that, and you have different versions of it. For those who might know German, German has ability of taking a noun, which they will stabilize, and adding a bazillion things to it as a way of actually making the noun the object, but it's done in a way that's, there's a word for it, but it's combined in a way that will allow it to actually take action as well as noun. So different languages have different structures around this. And that means that when you look at the development of NLP, so much of it is rooted in this assumption that we can find the noun, we can find the verb, we can find the object. Right? That's actually how the whole field has been going. So I can look up the name of the scholar for you, but I'm not going to do that right now. But if you want to talk to me afterwards, I am not an expert on this stuff, but there's an amazing scholar, a Cheyenne scholar, who's been doing just phenomenal work on AI and indigenous languages. But I use it as an example to point out that we have to constantly recognize that there are societies that think relationally, that there are languages that think relationally, and that English and American society are not among them. We think very much discretely in objects and verbs. And that is a moment for us to say, I'm not asking everybody here to learn a bazillion different languages. I'm asking you to learn that there are different ways of knowing and seeing. And indigenous communities are a very good example of this. The other thing I would point out about indigenous ways of knowing and seeing is that everything is always rooted within the physical space and time. And this is something that we do not do in English at the same level. Again, I can send some links to people. Beautiful work about asking people to be able to identify where north is and who can tell what north is. And the difference of that when you have a language where north is rooted into the language versus where it's not. Right? In English, it's not. We don't actually acknowledge north, so maybe you guys know enough about your geography to know where. But within many languages where north is rooted into the very act of hello, it doesn't matter where people are, they can always tell you where north is. So these are the things that get culturally rooted, and that's what I'm sort of putting at symbolically. But follow up with me, I can give you some great links, because I'm in awe of the indigenous and AI scholars that are doing phenomenal work in this area. Yeah. And Mike is there.
Hi, Dana. Sal Donde, a filmmaker and engineer. Thanks for that fast-paced talk. I have two questions. First one is very quick and fun. As a film buff, I couldn't identify that clip with the child doing the mic drop. Is that from a film or a music video?
Yes, I don't remember what I'm seeing. If I actually put notes in it, I probably
Is that a meme somewhere?
It's it's from the internet. What is this from? It's a meme, but I don't remember. I don't know. We'll have to look it up. We'll go back.
I feel better. If it's from a film and I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, you're gonna know films better than me. I know the internet.
A second question is in the great context of what you talked about. One of the paper you wrote stood out for me. It's a 2014 paper. I think the title says How Teenagers Are Navigating Social Context, but that's in 2014. I'm wondering, and this may be like a potential PhD dissertation, how the current generations who are growing up, who are born right now, Gen Alpha maybe, or Beta, I don't know. How would you speculate or maybe seeing early trends of how they're navigating the current, would you say, AI-driven technological landscape, as in how millennials or Gen Z were, how they were branded as, okay, this is a generation that grew up with internet, whereas us, we, in some way, Gen AI is kind of just augmented into our world, and now we're living with it, now we're kind of adjusting our society and laws around it.
So there's different versions of AI in this conversation, so let's try to break some down for some key examples. The first has to do with ways of cheating in school. It turns out people have always had ways of cheating in school. This is a great new way to cheat in school. It turns out that people don't like school, and that's not new. One of the things I'd love to remind people of, and I wrote about in the book, is that in the United States, compulsory high school was actually a political project in its own right, because in the 1890s, there was a moral reformer, G. Stanley Hall, who coined the term adolescence. And what he argued in 1890 was that the full soul of a child would be destroyed if they had to socialize with adults. And so he argued for compulsory high school as jail to keep kids away from those pesky adults. He didn't get very far until the Great Depression kicked in the United States, where a lot of labor unions realized that there were not enough jobs for the older men, and these 16-year-old boys could take the jobs away from them. So he teamed up, the labor unions teamed up with the moral reformers to create the jail that you grew up with. So I point this out because we've actually lost even reminding people about why they go to school, which is of course the difference between the United States and places where people are begging to get access to school. And so you'll see a big difference that's not really generational but cultural. If you are in a place where you are desperate to get an education, you don't give a shit about AI and trying to cheat on your classes. If you feel like school is a waste of time that you're stuck with, you'll do anything to get out of doing it so you can go back to doing anything you want to. So that's when we have to look at the social conditions of it. I point that out because I think it's really critical for us to see that it's not just the age or the cohort as it relates to the technology, but the broader social conditions there. Talking about another version of it, because people are obsessed with things like character AI and whether or not people can actually build emotional relationships with AI. I actually have had the privilege of being able to see a lot of the different queries and the different conversations that people have with at least one popular system. And one of the things that's so fascinating to me is they actually remind me of how people talk to their dogs, right? Which is like, you just want somebody to love you. You're like, I've had a bad day. And right, you talk to the dog licks you, right? Instead, the AI is sort of licking you back and saying like, it's okay, I love you in different forms. And I'm like, wow, right? It turns out that that need for validation, which has never always required humanness, has different layers. Are there exceptions that are deeply dark? Of course, we can talk about the dark exceptions. Those are what we pay attention to in the media. But the everyday dynamics are much more like, I got into a fight with my boyfriend, and like, I don't know what to say, and I don't want to talk to my best friend about it because like, she'll just judge me because she thinks my boyfriend sucks. So how should I think about this? And you're like, okay, that's a lot. And then you watch them walk through it, they're actually working through their own mindset. They're working through their own head. It's not about the AI. It's just an interactive tool that's allowing them to do that. That's fascinating. But there's a bigger problem. So when I wrote my book, I published my book in 2014, based on field work that I had done at that point for 15 years. And there were a couple of things that I sort of saw as long-term trends, and there were other things that I missed. One of the ones that I saw as a long-term trend was that we had removed children's access to public spaces. So don't listen to Jonathan Haidt, this did not start in 2012, it started actually in the 1970s, because we became afraid of and afraid for young people. We wanted to keep them out of public spaces. I used to love this quote by Mark Morales, who was the mayor of New Orleans, who had created this massive curfew, not allowing teenagers out in public space. And when it found out that it had absolutely no connection to either the safety of young people or violence in the town, he was like, our life is better without the kids in the public spaces. I'm like, that is not a good setup. So I say this because there's one thing that I really missed in my book, and it wasn't about technology. What I missed that kids were saying to me over and over again was that they had not just lost access to public space, they had lost access to non-custodial adults. What is a non-custodial adult? A coach, a mentor, a neighbor, a pastor, someone, an auntie, right? Like the people that were around and there for you. Why do I say that? Because what has happened by losing access to non-custodial adults is that you don't have people to turn to seek out advice for a perspective other than your parents and your friends. And it turns out for a lot of topics, people don't want to talk to their parents or their friends. And we can see that happening in AI right now. Now, why does that worry the hell out of me? Because during COVID, access to non-custodial adults was already low and went through the floor. And I thought it was bad in general until I'm a founding board member of an organization called Crisis Text Line. And when you're de-escalating a live suicide, the first thing you do is you get rid of the mode, right? You get rid of the gun, you get rid of the pills, you get rid of whatever would allow that child to die right now. The next thing, you do not solve the underlying problem in an emergency call. The next thing you do is you alternate plan. You come up with a plan of what the next 24 and 48 hours will look like. And the most critical component of the next 24 and 48 hours is to find a non-custodial adult that that person can turn to. And we've long struggled to find that person, and when COVID hit, we couldn't find anybody. We sent out more active rescues than I ever want to count because people couldn't come up with somebody that they could trust, that they could turn to tomorrow. That is terrifying. What was even more terrifying is that it did not improve after COVID eased up. Turned out adults are stressed. Teachers didn't want to deal with kids because they were going to get in trouble with parents. Laws are being put in place saying that if a kid comes to them around sexuality, they're to report it to the parents. All sorts of things have made it so that all adults are pedophiles. All adults are potential predators or going to corrupt our children in different ways. We have a generation right now who is coming of age unable to and unsocialized into large amount of access to adults. We also have an adult population who has stopped modeling socialization to children. Today's parents are less likely to actually bring other adults into the home and have dinner with the kids. They're going to have fun. They're going to see their friends out at a bar or a restaurant. Kids do not see their parents socializing. Kids do not see their parents negotiating conflict. This has become such an endemic problem that when I look at the AI content, I don't look at AI. I look at a reflection of what we've done socially. So my response to this AI situation is we need to start taking some serious accountability as adults and as parents about what we want to role model in terms of how to interact socially, what the projects of coming of age are, how to be a part of the world. And we as parents need to stop looking at our damn phones because they see us. And so I say all of this because I'm actually not seeing a massive change in what they're doing. I'm seeing a massive change in what we are doing as adults, and it scares me. And I actually don't want to put them on them or on the technology. I want us to start taking responsibility. And so that's actually why when I finished the census book, I finally committed to writing a parenting book, much to my horror, with a dear friend and colleague of mine, because we've been back in the field watching what's going on and how little it has to do with technology and how everything has to do with adult normalization. So AI, it's going to be a thing. I actually am very excited because I'm amazed at how many young people today are like, I ain't using it because of the environmental costs. I'm like, ding, 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 good job. So we have to look at what's going on. If we want to reclaim education, we have to actually remind ourselves what the education project is. And as all of us, as we lose our C3 statuses and our other fun with the EOs, we're going to all have to do that at higher ed and K-12. And I think it's a really good moment to stop taking for granted what the education project is and go back to it. And AI is just another thing that's making that visible to all of us. Yeah? Mike's coming your way.
Hi, thanks for the talk. There's a lot of very interesting ideas, and I would love to hear your ideas on how to translate them into action regarding AI. I was just trying to think about it, I guess, one is education, the AI developers, either tech bros or in fact developers of AI people, they don't know sociology, they hate all that kind of thing. Even myself, as a STEM person, I hated sociology until recently. Then I see, oh, it's super useful, but then those people, the tech, CS, they never think about it. And I mean, tech ethics is now apparently a mandatory course here for data science majors, but I heard half the kids hate it. And even they say, oh, why do we have complicated essay, why not just kind of yes or no? And also, even if they learn it, when they now become engineer at Meta, what can they do against Zuckerberg? And also, even those courses are very surface level and fake. They never kind of really critique capitalism. So yeah, maybe education on those people, and maybe we also need to build power for this side. I imagine some solutions or some interventions will have to be at the legal and policy level, but we also need a popular base, a popular education, engage with the public, and maybe some people need to build small scale positive examples. Yeah, I would love to hear your ideas on what can be done and what forms that could take. It's academia, industry, grassroots, and also, yeah, if you have examples of organizations, individuals that are doing like cool stuff like that. Thank you.
Small question. I'll try to tackle a couple pieces of it. Actually, a conversation I had with Eric probably a decade ago inspired me to teach a class because I had been thinking about the problems with ethics in data science for quite some time at that point. And you're right, I was a computer scientist. I didn't take a single humanities or social science class because I was brown and I could get away with it. And so it's very ironic how I ended up on this strange path because it wasn't what I was trained into. But I also, like many people in computer science, hated the mandatory, like, think big thoughts classes. I was like, this is annoying. And it was a conversation I had with Eric, I don't know if anyone remembers it, better over a decade ago, of basically how to mess with students until they're forced into thinking about ethics without even realizing it. And so I taught a class, my Introduction to Data Science class, where I decided to put into action what would it mean to teach ethics without ever mentioning the word ethics. And I had my students walk in on the first day, and they had to have Python, they had to have their environment set up, and I put a URL on the screen. And I was like, please load the file. It is a stop and frisk data set of New York City. I want you to tell me the average age of somebody who's been stopped. And the students are like, all right, I can do that. That's technical work. Da, 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 da. 27. And one by one, they're at 27. I'm like, is it right? And they look at me and I'm like, what are you talking about? We all got the same answer. I'm like, is it right? Everybody's still staring at me. I'm like, well, what does it mean? And people started to immediately jump into all of their social assumptions. I would have thought I was older because, so many people experiencing homelessness. I thought I was younger because of kids, etc. And I'm like, all right. But can you do me a favor? Can you please run a distribution of the age variable? Because I knew they all picked up the age variable. And they were like, why are so many people 0 and so many people 99? And I was like, funny that. Did that just screw with your distribution? They were like, And I'm like, there's actually 2 variables here. There's also a date of birth variable. Do they match? Here's the code for it. And everybody's like, they don't match. I'm like, funny that. Right? And all of a sudden, I've tricked an entire room into falling into a trap. My entire semester, I have to say, that was my most favorite teacher evaluations, was this one that said, the teacher trolled us, the professor trolled us also. She did. It was great. But one of my favorite ones to do for them, which is very much in light of all of the Facebook students, is that I gave them USB drives in teams of 4 with the latitude, longitude, and timestamp of a cell phone for 6 months. And I was like, please re-identify the target and build a full digital dossier of them. Right? And it turns out students are like, I can do that, la la la, homework, it's really obvious. Ooh, they have so much things on the internet, da 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 da. And they get very proud of themselves. It's a 3-week assignment, and on the 3rd week I told them they have to show the digital dossier in class to the class. What I didn't tell them is that when they would walk into that class, every single target that they had stalked would be there, that they'd have to present to the person that they had stalked. Yeah, that was fun. It was way fun. Turns out my friends are suckers and are very willing to do this. I say all of this because I do believe there is a way to teach ethics, and it doesn't require writing essays. I believe that you can teach ethics by forcing people into the uncomfortable places that they have to think it through, and that they can talk it through as they do this. The same class was the time the Ashley Madison data set was out there, and I was like, okay. Here's the Ashley Madison data set. For those who don't remember this was a data set of people cheating on their spouses. And it was leaked and it was stolen. And there's a lot of ethics about whether, yes? Oh, there's a lot of ethics about whether this was appropriate, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, your job is to be a data journalist and to propose a story, a journalist story that you will write on this database. And all sorts of people came back with dreadful recommendations of what the story should be. And I'm like, none of you took a moment to resist that assignment. And they were like, well, you told us to do it. I'm like, oh, so you do whatever you're told, even if it's deeply unethical. But you told us to do it, right? And so this is where you build muscles over time. And as educators, we can do that by pushing on folks, by helping them see what they're doing. Because the other thing is that anybody who's worked in industry knows you get into that narrow place. You are working on that one little thing for hours on end, and you don't see the bigger picture. How do you start to see that bigger picture? How do you start to see those entanglements? How do you figure those out? Those are the acts. And I'm watching it right now of how to actually think about ethics in practice. I mentioned that I've been dealing with Doge, who are my favorite characters on the planet right now. And I'm watching a bunch of government, civilians, or civil servants actually enact resilience and really think through how to protect the nation's assets from a hostile government takeover. And it is a powerful thing. And they got there not because that they weren't also working on the small things. They got there because there's been a lot of socialization process to help them see that. You can be socialized into this. You can be a part of a bigger picture. And this is the weird irony about the tech industry and how its compensation works. And this goes back to your capitalism point. In the United States, in the major tech companies, we are compensated overwhelmingly through stock. That means there is an incentive to make the stock keep going up so you can keep the employees. It also means that the employees have a shit ton of power. When they say, we don't want that stock to keep coming up, we will resist this process. And so there are acts of resistance. There are also acts of resistance by changing the financial ecosystems. If you have not, she's a neighbor here somewhere. Invite Catherine Bracey to come give a talk about her latest book, World Eaters. It is a beautiful book. And part of why it is a beautiful book is she critiques venture capitalism, but not in a traditional way. She points out that the narrowing of financial vehicles to invest in innovation has resulted in a form of toxicity. And then another act of resistance to this is by opening up the range of financial vehicles that can allow for innovation that does not need to scale exponentially. Because it's too much fun to pick on Meta. But think about Meta. How do they continue to improve their stock price? They have to find more users. Good luck. They have to diversify their profit and loss structures by actually, acquiring new businesses and new business models. They clearly suck at this. Or they have to get creepier and creepier as they extract more per person. Right? Why do they have to do that? They're profitable. They have to do that to appease a system on return of investment. Right? Climate tech doesn't ROI like that. That's not how climate tech works. But we don't have non-VC financial vehicles to invest in climate tech. So again, things that you can do are start to see those broader systems. And I want to see, and I think Catherine does the best job of calling out, alternate financial vehicles for investment that don't expect ROI, that don't expect that kind of psychotic growth. And the thing is that a lot of technical workers out there, they want to work for mission-driven organizations. But when your options are, the non-profit world, which is now just going to be decimated, or psychotic ROI industries, there's not a lot of room. And I was talking with somebody who does amazing neural brain link work, right? Phenomenal. And part of what's killing him right now is that his only option is Elon Musk's company. That's not good, right? And so this is where, even if you believe in capitalism, even if you believe in a market structure as a good thing, we are in a toxic market structure right now. We are not having competition. We're not having alternate structures. And so this is the thing that I sort of go back to. When I was coming up, as a computer scientist, it was possible to get many different kinds of financial investment to start companies. That isn't true now. And so this is where I say, look at those arrangements, get people to think beyond it, get them experientially involved in it. It doesn't require writing essays. There's many other ways to get there. And I think that this is, as an educational institute, you can do this well. Yes? You gotta get the mic.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about this toxic market structure that you just described and about I know it relates to technological solutionism. My question comes from a feeling, so I'll lay out the feeling and then I'll ask you the question.
Feel your vibes.
So I feel like you said that legal policies tend to be wrapped up in tech languages even more. And so big tech companies, as we see, they might resist regulation, but yet at the same time, they are defining the terms of regulation because of the dominance of their system and because of the complexity of their system. So this capacity to define complexity means that techno-legal solutionism becomes techno-legal determinism, which reinforce their monopoly because they are the only firms capable to apply these regulations because they write or they influence these regulations in the first place. So my question is, how would you reconcile the need for legal and human intervention with the complexity of the systems that are at play and are not going anywhere, as you said, without paradoxically reinforcing the monopoly, their monopoly, and their monopoly to shape the future?
So, I want to, one small challenge to this. Monopoly, as it's legally defined, requires a single company. One of the things that they have done so brilliantly is create the conditions for multiple companies so that there is a competition because they're working within a structural monopolistic issue rather than one. See current FTC. This is not unique to tech. And I'm actually intrigued by the examples where it happens outside of tech and how it's worked. One of the ones I read most recently, which is just a beautiful, there's a book, Michael Lewis, another one of your neighbors here, wrote a book of essays, he commissioned essays, called What is Government? And there's one in there about mining and mining safety. Because it turns out mining safety, no company has an incentive to actually stop killing its workers, which is actually disturbing when you think about it. But there's all sorts of economic ways in which they did it. And so you have this guy, and it's the story of a guy, because it's beautiful journalistic writing. And he spent the guy spent the whole time saying it's a team, so you know you got that problem of government. But you have this guy who's like, there is no reason why the roofs on mines, I'm bad at language, forgive me, have to collapse in. This can be solved. And he worked for decades to figure out how to recognize when a mine was about to collapse, and beautifully built frameworks for doing so. That, of course, required government. The government was the check to that power. Because the mining industry as a whole was willing to accept a certain amount of deaths. And the essay is beautiful. It talks about how he managed to get to the point where he had 0 mining deaths in a year, and how this is a miracle, et cetera, et cetera. I point this out because his journey, this one guy's journey, from being himself a miner, seeing the vulnerability, innovating first in academia, realizing he could never deploy it through either the mining companies themselves or the mining industry associations, and instead to going and building the structures within government, is a really fascinating tale on how these are actually systems level approaches to it. Where are the check to power? There are a lot of tech people right now who now know how the tech systems work, and they want to put a big middle finger up to the tech companies. This is an ideal moment where you enroll them into a form of governance. And you can see that happening in different places right now, and part of what we're facing in the United States is a recognition that that possibility is costly and a way of dismantling the government agencies that could actually do this, right? So it's not going to be the US, at least in the next 5 years, probably the next 20 by the rate we are going at this disaster. But it is going to be other places that are going to build those checks in where it becomes a way of checking those systems. Mining is a beautiful one. There's beautiful histories in what happens in medical and medical checks and balances. One of my favorite tomes, it's really good for like lifting your monitor, is a book called Reputation and Power. It's the history of the FDA, and it is kind of gorgeous, even if it is like literally 1,500 words, or 1,500 pages. But one of the things that they go through is how the FDA responded to, give me the drug, that where people were born with small arms and legs. Thalidomide, thank you. Thalidomide, of course, is invented in Germany and is seen as this anti-nausea medication, and everybody wants to roll it out fast. And the US goes, nope, we're not rolling it out, because it's, again, this is like a small number of people in the FDA, and we're like, we need to test this. People snuck the drug massively into the US because they were so pissed off at the FDA for failing to approve it. The FDA, in the end, of course, becomes aware of what the costs are of this drug on a pregnant woman's fetus, and ends up creating the laws that sort of outlaw this drug. It's why the FDA is the global actor at this point. It's all about thalidomide. It is the global actor in determining whether or not a drug is safe. That's no longer going to be true. That is not going to be the FDA going forward. That doesn't mean that there's not other agencies popping up. There are European agencies, there are Asian agencies that are popping up to replace that. And so what I say is that, like, at this moment, I am under no illusion that the US federal government is a check to this tech power. It is not. It will not be. But that does not mean that those conditions can't be done elsewhere. And I think we are watching a geopolitical rearrangement of power, of checks, of thinking about borders, about thinking about technologies. And so for those who really care about policy, this is the moment of seeing that rearrangement. And again, just like Castells is reminding you, you can create the conditions, you can create the networks strategically, but it doesn't mean fighting the system in the US. Sometimes it's going to be about rolling with whatever Canada is doing, suddenly getting a fascinating energy that it wants to coordinate European countries. That is weird and fascinating and intriguing. But like, there's going to be all of these new power arrangements. So actually, for a time, we are in a moment that is very much like what the thalidomide moment was, where there's a rearrangement that can be leveraged to actually push forward some of these things for thoughtfulness. But my key to this on tech is get away from the monopoly language. The monopoly language, I disagree fundamentally with Lina Khan. You cannot reclaim monopoly. You actually have to come up with a different way of looking at it in a form of late-stage capitalism. That is industrial era frameworks. It does not work in this world. And it's why we're trying to solve entangled global policies through tariffs. I think that is an extension of our weird monopoly logics that really, we're going to show how badly that works in an entangled world. And so I think that it is a time, and that's, for the young in the room, this is a time to reclaim and reimagine. We don't have to live with 19th century ideas of check to corp power. We can come up with new ones, and we're going to have to. All the way back. What do you have for me from Mike? And this is the last one. I'm seeing the looks that I'm getting.
Thanks, Dana, for the talk. My question is also about technical solutionism. The sort of canonical example that you gave is around COSA, where lawmakers are trying to compel platforms to sort of produce positive social outcomes. But this talk is also about responsible AI, and you, towards the end, kind of alluded to this idea of looking at a systems-based approach, thinking more socio-technically, and thinking more about resilience and so on. Do you think you could just kind of connect these 2 points? Could you give an example of technical solutionism in AI regulation, and kind of how you'd like to see the policy landscape move for that technology?
So, modulo the AI Act in Europe, let's not pretend we actually have AI regulation. I think that's part of what's challenging at this moment, is that the AI regulation is spinning itself in circles and thinking that it's just going to be able to control a specific model or the inputs. My favorite is my colleague Cooper's work on how unlearning is going to be the answer to AI models that gobble up things that they shouldn't. I really love his sort of framing on this, where he points out that that is the equivalent to giving a machine a lobotomy because you think that it's being hysteric. And he means that with every form of pejorative reference there. Because I think that that's an example for me of a very solutionistic approach that we're seeing out of Europe, which is just we can remove this. And so his name is A. Feder, F-E-D-E-R, Cooper, C-O-O-P-E-R. His writing on unlearning is fascinating because he shows just the absolute technical ineffectiveness of this and why that is not the right path forward. He works with a bunch of different collaborators, and I just recommend his work highly. But I say that because that's the closest that I've seen to true AI regulation that I think is missing the boat. Most of it is actually use case regulation right now. Thou shalt not use it for this, that, or the other, which I do find highly entertaining. I will say the Biden administration's version of this in the US was kind of laughable because there was a ruling to the government agencies that thou shalt not use AI. And all of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration was like, what do you think weather modeling is? And they're like, we're just going to call it statistics, applied statistics. So they just relabeled their work as applied statistics, it's a bloody AI model. It's been an AI model for 40 years. So this is where we also get these interesting challenges of like, even when you talk about use case, you know, like federal government is not all law enforcement, right? And I actually am a big fan of NOAA using AI. I think it's a good thing. Of course, that assumes that NOAA persists because we've got the Weather Channel. So the reason I point out, so I have many issues with the current child online safety bills. And I give you a little bit on AI, but I want to answer that other component because I think it's important. And it's important because of the politics of the moment. The Kids Online Safety Act is not about kids or safety. It's just like when we regulate things that are, you know, pretending like we're going to deal with labor, it is about AI. The Kids Online Safety Act was very explicit. In fact, you gotta love the co-sponsor of it for being put on tape, saying that she wanted to protect children from the transgender and their indoctrination. Right? And she was explicit about it. And that was why she created COSA. And so we have this moment where we also see bills like this that look really nice. They're going to protect kids' online safety, but that's not what they're about. And so the paper that Maria and I wrote was trying to deal with one very specific things of it, but my pissiness for COSA goes much deeper than that particular component. And I think that that's also, you know, important to see because when you looked actually at the actual bill, who was allowed to have standing to bring cases forward was going to be the state attorneys general. And core to that was a component of the duty of care. I referenced bullying, but of course the component of care, of duty of care, which is that kids should not be experiencing mental duress. I don't know about you, but I get mental duress reading the news. So what is the content that we're supposed to block kids from experiencing mental duress? The reality is that when you have a standing that's a state AG's and you have mental duress, this is just an open gift to basically bring things against any content you don't like. And that's what that bill was really about. But it was also about creating so much flexibility that could bring any case against this. This is the fight over Section CD 230, for those who are familiar with that fight. So these are all sorts of dismantlements. And so I point this out because one of the keys to the census book, I vowed that you guys can invite me back to talk about census, but one of the keys to the census book is I make an argument called Jenga politics. And I say that when we have infrastructure, when we have systems and laws and technical components and whatnot into infrastructure, we can think about them as the 54 wood block piece. Where what happens is people start to take pieces out of the wooden structure and put pressure on top. They take pieces out and they put pressure on top. And in this particular case, I'm referring to a federal administrative agency because that's what's been happening for our federal government now for many, many years. And the thing is you create this weakening, and what is the point of Jenga? The point of Jenga is to let the tower fall but get somebody else to take the blame for it, right? And so I've watched as these systems, and my sort of metaphor taking one step further, civil servants are running around with duct tape being like, please keep the tower intact, we can do it, right? And there's a lot of that going on. And so I think that we need to see what's below, right? I'll call out Susan Lee Starr and her invitation to think about the boringness of infrastructure. Because we need to see what's going on there, what's being put on top. And so for me, when I look at a lot of these bills, the bills are not responding to the moment. They are playing a different kind of politic. If you really want to go after AI from a policy place, you tax the hell out of compute. If you want to go after social media, you tax the hell out of advertising. Right? There's all sorts of ways you can go at it, but you go at it from the structure rather than thinking that you can just rearrange what's happening on top. And this is, to me, in US politics, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats for decades has been that the Republicans take out pieces of infrastructure and Dems put the pressure on top. And that is how we got to where we are right now and why Doge is so terrifying. Because what they are doing is dealing with the fact that there's so much pressure on top created by Dems for so long that all they have to do is just take a key piece out from underneath and you lose key pieces of infrastructure. So I say that because as we're looking for policy, don't just focus on what are the things we can add And so much of policy these days, especially AI policy, is like, let's just add more burdens. And I'm like, let's not. Let's figure out how to actually arrange the system so that the kinds of things that are possible have more constraints in them. And with that, I got the glares. Thank you.